Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks for talking to us. I think this is, I might have told you this last time, but it's sort of unscientific. But I think if I could take a poll of all the listeners to this program, their favorite film director, I think you would be number one. So
Wow.
therefore, a new Chris Nolan film is something which is genuinely, it's that sense of Christmas Eve. It's the sense of anticipation is palpable.
No pressure.
Absolutely none. And when we did this interview last time around for Interstellar, listeners would not have been a part of this process because you stopped the interview because the noise coming from next door was so extraordinary that you thought, this is so distracting, I'm going to stop. And it turned out it was Anne Hathaway who was just laughing so much.
I was giving an interview. Don't start any rumours here. It was Anne doing an interview in the next
She was
door
just
room.
No, she was just enjoying an interview. Anyway, it's fantastic to have you back on the show. How long has telling the Dunkirk story been a part of your mind?
I mean, a long time. I think, like most British people, I grew up with the story. I don't even remember the first time, somebody told me about the events of Dunkirk. But a key moment in me wanting to make the film was about 20 years ago. Emma, my wife and producer, and we hitched a ride on a friend's boat. He wanted to make the crossing on his small sailboat, the crossing to Dunkirk at about the same time of year the evacuation had taken place. And we underestimated the difficulty of it. The channel was very rough. It was extremely cold, very challenging physically. The crossing took a lot longer than it should have. It took about 19 hours. And it felt dangerous. It felt difficult. I mean, really difficult. And I came away from that experience with an extraordinary admiration and respect for people who made that journey in 1940 into a war zone. I mean, people dropping bombs on them. Making that crossing really cemented for me a fascination with the story and started me asking the question as to why in modern cinema has this never been addressed, even though I think it's one of the great stories in human history.
And what was the answer to that?
I think the answer to it is it's a British subject that requires an American budget. And I found myself in a position a couple of years ago where I developed a very good relationship with the Hollywood studios, with Warner Brothers in particular. There's a lot of trust on both sides. And I found myself able to come to them and say, look, you may not know this story. This is a British story, beloved in the culture of Britain. People talk about the Dunkirk spirit and so forth. But I think it's one of the great universal stories. And I think if we can cast it with unknowns at the center of it, if we can really give the audience the experience of being there, really, really tell this in a suspenseful manner, because I see it as one of the great suspense stories of all time. Hopefully we can make something that can play internationally, that could be universal, that could speak to an American audience as well as a British audience.
Because it's a survival story.
It's a survival tale, and it's an incredibly primal and fundamental story. The geography of the story, if you like, is very simple. 400,000 men on a beach, their backs to the sea, the enemy closing in on all sides, in sight of home practically, but no way to get there. And they're faced with the choice between surrender or annihilation. And the fact that this story does not end in either surrender or annihilation is why it's one of the greatest stories in human history.
And having decided that you were fascinated and that you had interest and you had the budget, how long did it take you to work out what kind of film to make and which stories you were going to tell? Because Dunkirk has got thousands of stories.
Hundreds of thousands. I mean, there are myriad stories, and it's tough to know where to start. There are so many different versions of this film that could have been made over the years. There are many different versions that I might have tried. But in the end, what I settled on is what I think is most vibrant about films these days, which is what I call a cinema of experience. I really wanted to tell the story subjectively. I immersed myself in first-hand accounts. I brought on Joshua Levine as a historical consultant. He's a historian who compiled a book of first-hand accounts of people who were really there. And what I wound up doing was researching the history, getting the evacuation and the events of the evacuation sort of in my bones, if you like, kind of under my fingers. And then I created a fictional set of characters to guide the audience through the events. And I divided my telling of the story into three main strands, broadly speaking, land, sea, and air. And the reason I did this is I wanted to tell everything in a subjective way. I wanted the audience to have an incredibly suspenseful and intense experience and really feel that they're there on the beach, really feel that they're there in the cockpit of a Spitfire, really feel that they're on a boat coming over to help with the evacuation. So rather than cutting to generals in rooms or politicians explaining things, I wanted to stay with a human scale of storytelling, but use these different perspectives to gradually build up a larger picture of the events.
It was someone else's observation. When I came out of the film, I wanted to go straight back in and see it again. That was my first reaction, because you had told this astonishing story, and what you'd done. I mean, I felt as though it is a visceral experience. It's, if you see it projected properly and with a great sound system, I saw it in IMAX, as I think you should see it. It will blow you away for a couple of hours, and yet it is so much a silent film. It feels at times like a silent picture. The dialogue is not up front and center here.
No, I'm a great admirer of the silent era, and as a filmmaker, to go back and draw inspiration from it is wonderful, because it's a completely different way of telling stories before dialogue came along, and so it can be very inspiring. It can make you think about things in a slightly different way. And as we thought about, okay, what's the right telling for this story, I kept coming back to the language of suspense. I was looking at the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock, Clouseau, Wages of Fear, in particular, the French film from the 50s, was a big influence. But the thing about suspense is it's primarily visual. And if you look at Hitchcock, it's very much visual storytelling. And so I really wanted to try and strip away the usual theatrics. And I don't mean that, when we talk about dialogue and the way people put things in the mouths of characters, that's the way I've been making films for many years, and I'm sure I'll go back to it. But for this film, I felt like I wanted to create a film where you didn't care about the characters on screen because they were telling you who they were and why you should care about them, or making the case for why you care about them. I wanted to just care about them using that wonderful thing about cinema that's very unique to cinema, which Hitchcock understood better than anybody, which is you'll care about a character on screen because of their physical dilemma, because of a task they're trying to accomplish, because you fear for their physical safety, because you wouldn't want to be in their position. And so I really wanted to very deliberately put the audience into the shoes of the characters on screen and create empathy that way in what I call the present tense, not worrying about who they are or whether they've got a girlfriend back home or whatever, the usual cinematic devices. I wanted to strip all that away and make a very, very kind of a lean, suspense-driven story.
And part of that suspense comes again from the astonishing music of Hans Zimmer, which one of the reasons why you'll leave after a couple of hours utterly drained is the astonishing score. I mean, I've listened to the few tracks that are out already that you can hear, and I was immediately back in the cinema and really stressed out. Can you explain, in your words, Chris, what he brings to your movies and why you go back to him?
Well, Hans has brought many different things to the films that I've worked on with him in many different ways. This film was a little different in that we knew right from script stage, I'd written the script according to certain musical principles of structure. You primarily a thing called the shepherd tone, which at first explored in music with David Julian, the composer on The Prestige. And it's a sort of audio illusion whereby pitch is continually ascending but never goes out of the range. So it's constantly ascending. And I wanted to actually write the script and see if I could do that in words. So create a story that was always getting more intense, always getting more intense. And so that's how the three storylines are braided together. And early on, I went to Hans and showed him the script and said, I've written it according to this structure. We need a rhythmical structure for the music that we're going to build out of this sound. And I gave him a recording I had made of a watch that I own with a particularly insistent ticking. And what I asked him to do, and he did along with his team, and there were a lot of people involved in this that he brought on, to create a sort of rhythmic equivalent of the written narrative. So as we were cutting picture, a lot of this work was done before we even started filming, but as we were cutting picture, we would layer in these tracks he would give us and gradually build up a relationship between the music track, the sound effects, and the picture. And in this way, for better or for worse, it's not for me to say, but we've created a fusion of music, sound effects, and picture that we've never been able to achieve before.
Well, I mean, I think it's an astonishing success. I think it was fabulous. I want to do some listeners' questions in just a moment. Can I just mention two of the actors? I want to mention Tom Hardy's eyes, which are required to work harder than his eyes have ever been asked to work before. Can you just explain a little bit why?
Well, I made Dark Knight Rises with Tom with his face almost completely covered, and I was so amazed by what he was able to achieve with just his eyes that when it came time to cast this Spitfire pilot, and I didn't want to do what they used to do in old movies, which is every time they need to see the actor, he would sort of pull his oxygen mask off, which isn't how these pilots really flew. They would have their gear on the whole time once it went on, and I knew that Tom, having worked with him with his face almost completely obscured, I knew that he'd rise to the challenge of covering up even more of his face. You talk about his eyes. I think there's one key moment in the film where you can really only see one of his eyes, and what he's able to do with that one eye is more than most actors could do with their whole bodies.
It's a masterclass. Was there any point, Chris, in the filming when you had? I think at one stage you had 62 ships. That you were working with, because you're working with real ships and real planes and actors in the planes, and you've got the cameras in the planes. Was there any point where you thought, I wonder if I've chosen the right method? Have I actually bitten off too much here?
I think when you look at the logistical challenges of the film, trying to do things for real, we've got thousands of extras on that beach, but I've done that kind of thing before. We've got very, very complex aerial unit photography. But I've done that before as well, not to this extent. We pushed that a lot further than we ever have. But I had some grounding in it. What I'd never done before is boats, and to sort of go in with what I'm told is the largest marine unit in movie history. That was very daunting, and the sheer challenge of trying to orient the boats, get them in the right place at the right time for the shot, with that many vehicles, it's difficult, very difficult. But I had a great team of people who came together. There was a lot of planning that went into it, and it felt worth that extra effort. When you get to moments where you see the little ships participating in the evacuation, and you realize those are the real little ships who actually did it in 1940, and they've come back across the channel for us to make that journey, recreate that journey for our cameras. That compared with the CG alternative or whatever, it makes it all worthwhile. But it was certainly challenging.
Couple of listeners' questions before we finish. Richard Holliday, could this be the first in a series of World War II films? Battle of Britain is crying out for a modern interpretation. Plus, it might remind Steven Spielberg that Britain was actually involved in the Second World War. If we forget that second bit particularly, but you're right. That same spirit that you're talking about Dunkirk, about stories that are waiting to be told again.
It's longer ago that the story of Dunkirk's been told in films, and so I think it's the more egregious sort of omission in a way. But at the same time, I don't want to give away too much about the film, but there is the sense in which Dunkirk plays as prologue to the Second World War. There is a very real sense in which, at the end of the film, you feel that you're at the beginning of something, you're at the start of something. And I feel that that's a rhythm that modern filmgoers, younger filmgoers, are very, very familiar with. Frankly, just looking at all different types of films that try to sort of build a world or try to build the potential for sequels or all the rest, we wanted to tap into some of that energy for the end of the film and sort of remind people of, like, this was just the beginning of a massively long and arduous process. So the film is complete in itself, but it certainly doesn't shy away from the fact that this is the very beginning of World War II.
And was it at any stage useful to have a director with the experience of Ken Branagh, who you put at the end of a pier for? I'm sure he could give you sort of some fine support there. Just say, it's fine, I understand what you're going through. I'll just stay here. Don't worry about me.
Very much. No, he had a very long walk off, mercifully a very long pier, but we were stuck at the end of that thing out in the weather, and having a fantastic actor, but also a fantastic actor who's a brilliant director as well, who completely understands what I'm up against and is looking at all the elements. He was a huge asset, and I can't say enough great things about him. I'd wanted to work with him for a long time. I was a little bit daunted working with such a great director as well, but he was wonderful to work with and a huge help.
Dare I ask you what you're challenged to do next?
I have no idea. Go on holiday. I'm terrible at doing more than one thing at a time, so when I get into a film, I just spend a couple of years totally in that movie, and the movie isn't finished for me until it goes out to its audience and they tell me what it is I've done.
Well, I think it's a wonderful achievement, and Chris, we appreciate you always coming on the show. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.